Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready to dive into something a little bit different today. We're gonna be tackling some tough topics like war and escapism. But the cool thing is, the source material we're looking at today isn't like your typical news report or opinion piece. We're going poetic today with a piece called Tagesschau.
Yeah, Tagesschau is definitely not just, some pretty words on a page. It throws us right into five distinct perspectives, each one like ratcheting up the intensity, and you get to the end and you're just like, whoa, where did that come from?
Okay, so the poem starts off with this crazy image of a bullet flying through the air, and it's not just any bullet, right? It's that one bullet that makes you realize everything's about to change. The author isn't wasting any time; they just drop us right into the action.
And it's really interesting how they immediately personalize that experience,
Yeah.
using the second person you to make the reader feel like they're the one facing this like life or death situation. It's a really clever way to grab your attention and just like set the stage for this emotional roller coaster that's about to unfold.
And unfold it does. The first perspective just slams us right into a war zone through the eyes of a mother who's desperately trying to escape.
Yeah.
And it's written in these short, sharp bursts, like shattered pieces of thought, death, gunshots. I just want to get out. It's raw and chaotic, and you can just feel the terror just clawing at her.
Yeah, the author uses this technique called fragmentation to like mirror the shattering effect of war on the human psyche. It's not just the physical world that's breaking apart, it's like the mother's sense of reality, her ability to even process what's happening, and the sensory details like the ground feeling like lava, the explosions, the thick smoke. It all just amplifies that feeling of overwhelming fear and urgency.
And then just when you think you're bracing for more, bam, we're yanked out of that war zone and plopped down on a couch next to someone who's nursing a hangover. Talk about whiplash. They're groaning about the alarm clock, grabbing the first wrinkled shirt they can find. It's almost comical after what we just witnessed.
And that sudden shift to a completely different scene, it's totally deliberate. And it highlights how the author is using juxtaposition. We go from the mother's fight for survival to someone complaining about their flat hair. It's a stark reminder of how easily we can become detached from the suffering of others, just totally caught up in our own, like, petty concerns.
But before we get too comfortable, Judge King, the poem throws us right back to the mother. But this time the stakes are even higher because she's not alone now. She's got her children with her, and they're asking about their shoes in the middle of this war zone. It's heartbreaking, and it adds this whole other layer of responsibility and fear to her desperate escape.
That small detail about the shoes, it's genius. It humanizes the situation, reminds us that even in the middle of the chaos and brutality of war, like those ordinary moments of life, they still exist. It also amplifies the tragedy by juxtaposing the children's innocent questions with the horrifying reality they're facing. It forces us to confront the devastating impact of war, especially on the most vulnerable.
Perspective number 4 takes us on a different kind of escape. This time, it's a traveler who's obsessed with finding the perfect beach getaway. White sand, crystal clear water, anything to avoid the boring world. It's like they're deliberately blind to the suffering that's unfolding elsewhere.
It's interesting how the author uses imagery here to create a contrast between the traveler's privileged world and the mother's desperate struggle. Those luxurious details, white sand, crystal clear water, they emphasize the traveler's detachment from reality, their ability to just choose to ignore what's happening elsewhere. It raises some uncomfortable questions about our own complicity in the systems that allow these disparities to exist.
And just when you think you've got the pattern figured out, war, escape, repeat, the 5th perspective hits you like a tidal wave. We're back with the mother, but this time she's facing a new threat, drowning on a sinking boat, still desperately clinging to her children.
This final perspective is the culmination of the mother's journey, and it's just packed with symbolic meaning. That image of her drowning but somehow still surviving speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, especially a mother's determination to protect her children. It also reinforces this cyclical nature of suffering, how even when you escape one threat, another one might be right around the corner.
One thing that really struck me about the structure of this poem is how each perspective ends with the first word of the next one. It's like this chain reaction pulling you from one scene to the next without a moment to breathe. What do you think the author's trying to achieve with that?
That's a great observation, and it's a technique the author is using very deliberately to create this sense of momentum and disorientation. It mirrors the unpredictable, chaotic nature of war itself, how it can upend lives in an instant and leave you feeling like you're constantly being thrown from one crisis to the next. It also reinforces the interconnectedness of these seemingly like disparate experiences.
It definitely makes you stop and think about how all these different realities coexist, even if we don't always see them. So what's the takeaway here? What's the author trying to tell us with this roller coaster of emotions?
I think on a deeper level, the author's challenging us to confront our own privilege and apathy. By juxtaposing these drastically different experiences, they're forcing us to acknowledge the vast inequalities in the world and how easy it is for us to become desensitized to the suffering of others.
It's a powerful reminder that whose stories get heard and whose struggles get ignored is often just a matter of perspective. And that's something worth reflecting on, don't you think?
Yeah, it really is. And the author doesn't just like present these jarring perspectives. They actually take the time to kind of unpack why they made those choices. They even describe like each shift as a punch to the face, like they're really trying to wake the reader up to reality.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely see that. It's not subtle, that's for sure, but it's definitely effective. They're not letting us off the hook with easy answers or, feel-good platitudes. It's more like, hey, wake up. This is what's happening in the world, even if you don't want to see it.
Exactly. And they're using those like stark contrasts, those jarring transitions to disrupt our complacency, force us out of our comfort zones. It's like shining a spotlight on the things we'd rather just ignore.
And speaking of shining a spotlight, they also talk about that clever technique of connecting each perspective, using the last word of one as the first word of the next. It creates this like float, this momentum that pulls you through the poem, even as it's throwing you off balance.
It's brilliant, right? It's like this literary domino effect where each piece sets off the next. But it's not just about creating momentum, it's also highlighting the interconnectedness of these experiences, even though they seem worlds apart on the surface. The traveler's escape is only possible because of the mother's struggle. Our comfort is often built on someone else's suffering.
Wow, that's deep. And the author even goes further, saying those rapid shifts between viewpoints are meant to evoke extreme emotions in the reader. It's not just about understanding the concepts, it's about feeling them viscerally.
That's the power of poetry, isn't it? It bypasses our logical filters and just hits us right in the gut. The author wants us to experience the whiplash, the disorientation, the emotional roller coaster, because that's what mirrors the unpredictable nature of war itself. It disrupts lives, it shatters hopes, and it can leave people reeling in an instant.
So it's not enough to just read about war and escapism. We need to feel them in our bones to truly understand their impact. But the author doesn't just leave us reeling in despair. They also offer a call to action, encouraging readers to try this perspective-shifting technique in their own writing.
That's a crucial takeaway, because even though this piece is specifically about war and escapism, the underlying concept is applicable to so many aspects of life. Understanding different viewpoints is essential for effective storytelling, for building empathy, for navigating a world where diverse perspectives often clash.
Right. And of course, no deep dive would be complete without a little bit of self-promotion. The author does plug their book, Poetry Master, as a guide to mastering this technique. But even if we don't all become poets, that underlying principle of perspective shifting is something we can all benefit from.
Absolutely. It's about stepping outside of our own limited viewpoint, acknowledging that there are other ways of seeing the world, and that those other perspectives might challenge our assumptions, make us uncomfortable, but ultimately enrich our understanding of the human experience.
So let's bring this back to you, our listener. Think about your own life, your own experiences. What two contrasting perspectives could you explore that would really challenge your own assumptions?
What stories could you tell or listen to that would broaden your understanding and open your eyes to new possibilities?
Yeah.
Maybe it's the perspective of someone from a different culture, a different socioeconomic background, someone whose beliefs seem completely at odds with your own.
It's an exercise that can be both illuminating and honestly a little uncomfortable. But hey, isn't that where the real growth happens? When we step outside our comfort zones and allow ourselves to be challenged.
Precisely. And speaking of being challenged, we can't overlook the author's rather cheeky sign-off, "Be creative," Stefan. It adds this intriguing layer of personality to the piece, don't you think?
Totally. It's like a wink from the author, a reminder that even when dealing with heavy topics like war and escapism, there's still room for humor, for self-awareness, for a little bit of irreverence. And you know what? It makes the author feel more human, more relatable, which in turn can make their message even more powerful.
I agree. It's a subtle reminder that behind every piece of writing, there's a person with their own thoughts, feelings, and experiences.
Hmm.
And those personal touches can sometimes be the most impactful elements of all.
So we've explored those 5 powerful perspectives in Tagesschau. We've unpacked the author's own analysis of their work, and we've even challenged you to do a little perspective shifting of your own. But before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one more thread I want to unravel, one more question that's been swirling around in my mind. Remember how the author challenged us to try that perspective shifting in our own writing? Well, they also asked this really interesting question. If they could add a 6th perspective to Tagesschau, whose voice would we want to hear?
That's such a thought-provoking question, because it pushes us beyond the five voices that are already there and makes us think about, whose perspectives are often missing from these conversations about war and displacement.
Right. And it makes you realize that even a poem with 5 different viewpoints, it's still just a snapshot. Just a glimpse into this much larger, more complex reality. There are always more stories to be told, more voices waiting to be heard.
Yeah, and it challenges us to think critically about representation too. Whose stories are usually amplified and whose stories are silenced. It's so easy to get caught up in our own bubbles, surrounded by people who think and feel the way we do. But this exercise, it forces us to step outside of those comfortable spaces and consider, a wider range of experiences.
So let's put that challenge out to you, our listener. If you could add a 6th perspective to Tagesschau, whose voice would you choose and why?
Would it be the soldier on the front lines? The one grappling with the moral complexities of war? Or maybe a refugee who's lost everything and has to flee their home and start over in a completely new place?
What about a journalist risking their life to report the truth from a war zone? Trying to cut through all the propaganda and show the human cost of conflict. Or maybe someone totally unexpected, someone whose story we rarely hear, but who offers a crucial piece of the puzzle.
It's a question worth really thinking about. What would their story add to this whole tapestry of experiences? How would their perspective challenge or, maybe even enrich our understanding of war and escapism? Would it offer a glimmer of hope in all the darkness, or would it force us to confront even more uncomfortable truths?
I think the beauty of this open-ended question is that there's no right or wrong answer. It's really all about encouraging thoughtful reflection and expanding our ability to empathize with others. It's about recognizing that every story, every voice matters.
And that's what a good deep dive is all about, right? Challenging our assumptions, sparking new ideas, and leaving us with more questions than answers. It's not about wrapping everything up neatly with a bow, It's about igniting that curiosity that'll keep burning long after the episode is over.
Exactly. So as we wrap up our exploration of Tagesschau, we want you to keep that author's question in mind. Whose voice would you add to the mix and why? Maybe it'll even inspire you to do a little perspective shifting of your own, whether it's in your writing your conversations or just the way you approach the world.
And if you're looking for a little guidance on how to do that, remember the author's recommendation. Poetry Master, Poesycraft, and Seven Tagen. But even without it, the key takeaway here is the power of understanding and embracing diverse viewpoints. It's a skill that'll serve you well no matter what path you're on.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So be creative, Stefan, and be creative, everyone. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep those perspectives shifting.